Hello and welcome to the inaugural IPQ debate hosted by Internationale Politik Quarterly, the English edition of Germany's leading foreign affairs magazine, Internationale Politik. I'm Henning Hoff, executive editor of IPQ. A geopolitical commission. That's what European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen promised in 2019, at a time when Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was still 2.5 years away. Since then, the EU, or perhaps just the European Commission, has certainly made some steps in that direction, and it has become commonplace in political discussions in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, Rome, and Warsaw, elsewhere, to agree that Europe needs to become more geopolitical. What's been lacking so far, however, and that is why we dedicated the cover section of the IPQ winter issue to the topic, and you can see the cover behind my shoulder there, is geostrategy. That is to say, there's been a big question mark when it comes to the strategic dimension of the EU's new geopolitical ambitions. Yes, there is the enlargement and reform process, there is global gateway, and so on, but most would agree that Europe is still far away from thinking, and not to speak of acting, geostrategically. That is certainly true when it comes to the EU's biggest member, Germany. So today we ask, what strategy for Europe? What geostrategy for Europe? And to discuss this, I have the great pleasure of welcoming two contributors to the winter issue. You'll be hearing from Ambassador Romana Vlahutin, visiting Distinguished Fellow for Geostrategy at the German Marshall Fund's Brussels office. Previously, she served as EU Special Envoy for Connectivity with the European External Action Service between 2019 and 2022, spearheading the EU's connectivity strategy, and connectivity, one may argue, is EU speak for geostrategy. Previously, she was EU ambassador to Albania, and before that, foreign policy advisor to the president of Croatia. Her article for the IPQ winter issue is titled Europe's Geostrategic Awakening, and I much recommend it. Welcome, Romana.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting and having me.
Thank you. I'll just go on with the introduction and then we hear from you in a moment.
Sure.
Because I want to say that we also have with us James Rogers, joining us from London. James is a co-founder and director of research of the Council on Geostrategy, one of Britain's newest and certainly most influential think tanks. James and his colleagues' work has strongly influenced the so-called Integrated Review, a wide-ranging document published by the British government in March 2021, which sketches out a global strategy for the UK, and its refresh of 2023, published 2 years later, in response to Russia's war against Ukraine. His article for IPQ is titled British Geostrategy and the Defense of Europe, which I certainly recommend as well. Welcome, James.
Thank you. Good to be here.
To start us off, we will be hearing from both our speakers as to what kind of geostrategy they recommend, with Romana focusing also on the many ways the EU will need to change, and James exploring the question whether the British approach could be a blueprint or something the other Europeans could complement. Some quick technical remarks. Please note that this event will be recorded. We will be opening for questions and comments about 30 minutes in. Please have your points of debate, questions or comments ready. For the Q&A, we'd much prefer for you to raise your hand, and when called, please introduce yourself and put your point directly to our speakers. You're also welcome to use the chat functions. And with a word of thanks to my editorial colleague, Sharon Dowling, who, as always, co-edited the new issue, as well as to our colleagues in the DGAP events and communication teams. Let's start with Romana, please.
Great. Thanks a lot, Henning. Again, thanks for having me. We discussed briefly before, these are very complex issues. They would take days, not hours. So for the hour we have, I will try to focus on some key things, but again, it will be just scratching the surface. I want to first mention 3 gaps that I think we need to deal with immediately, in a way. The first one we are at a inflection point in terms of global governance, and I think decisions that will be made in the next few years will define European Union positioning in decades to come. And there is a lot of frustration and a lot of expectations for Europe to behave with the agility and the brain of a geopolitical power, but European Union was not created and was not structured to be a geopolitical power in the first place. It was created to take care of peace in Europe. And as I said in my article, it's first and foremost an introversial power. The security protection from the US provided space for European Union to become strong in social and economic sense, but has completely sort of devoted from the capacity to think about primarily security, but then also its foreign policy in a geopolitical way. So you have decades of European Union functioning with basically trade policy and development policy being proxy for foreign policy on the European level. There is also confusion in that sense between what is policy and what are instruments, because of the strength of the Commission, which has instruments in hands, it became blurred. And a lot of people, what in a normal state would be considered an instrument, here is seen as a policy. This fact reflects in the institutional culture, in the silos mentality, in the fact that today, if I would ask you who does foreign policy in European Union, it would be very hard to point to one place, because it's in a way divided, sometimes in a competitive way, between the Council, Commission, member states, individual member states, EIS, although, of course, the treaties give foreign policy decision-making, foreign and security policy decision-making to the Council and the member states, but it's blurred. And it's not clear, and it's my experience also from the institutions. It's not only that 27 member states have their own foreign policy, have their own take on foreign policy as well when it comes to the thing that they cover. The second gap is another frustrating thing. It's a gap between capabilities and capacity. Capabilities are many. And I think without doubt, we would all agree that in terms of its economic power, in terms of its normative power, in terms of its attraction power, there are very many capabilities that EU has, but it doesn't have a capacity to act as a power. And this is, again, something that is very frustrating, because you constantly have this perception that you're strong, but when it comes to acting, you are not, because the only way that sort of capacity to act is created is reaction to crisis. So if you're constantly just reacting to crisis, I would argue you're not a geopolitical power. If you are not 1, 2, 3 steps ahead, but always just in reaction, you are not a geopolitical power. And the third gap, and this is what I want to focus on, is 2024, is the year we have entered, which has key elections for European Union. So elections for the European Parliament, where we will see the new balance of power in Europe, and of course elections for the US. And it's really interesting to me, sitting here in Brussels, there is far more discussion on what European Union or what Europe is going to do if Trump is elected than what and how do we reform ourselves. What do we do with ourselves to become much stronger and much more capable to function? The only exception might be a discussion on qualified majority vote, which I don't believe is a silver bullet at all. And we can discuss it, but I think it eventually can create much more problems than solutions. And there is, if I'm not wrong, an EPP proposal on the reform of the way foreign policy is done by basically abolishing the EIS, creating a new commissioner for defense, and creating something that would be foreign minister of the European Union. The question that you posed to us for decision was what geostrategy for Europe? I think the first is we need to be realistic. The discussion on geopolitical Europe goes between two extremes in a way. One is dismissiveness of Europe, very sort of bleak, almost sometimes ridicule of European ambition to be more geopolitical. And another one is cheerleading. Whatever little thing is done, there is huge enthusiasm, as if, you know, a major victory has been won. I think we need to be realistic, and honestly, where we are in terms of the maturity of these institutions to do foreign and security policy and the history of European Union, I think that European Union can be a very solid middle power, but not more than that. At the moment, in some key conflicts, we're not even a middle power. Just think of the Middle East. So I think it's important to have a realistic goal and understand in which theaters we can and do make a difference, and try to focus on those. The second thing is, I think is really important, and we have a year basically before the next cycle of institutions is created. Who does foreign policy in Europe? That has to be clarified. And what are the instruments with which we do foreign policy? Because foreign policy is not measured by the amount of papers you write and put, you know, strategy on the top and then mention the word strategic several times on the paper, but by the outcomes. So what are the outcomes of the foreign policy actions that European Union is undertaking? I personally think that the only serious strategic thinking at the moment is around Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia group. And I was really almost shocked when I saw the Council conclusions from December, how differently, in a strategic sense, these three countries were handled, and, for example, the Western Balkans, which is just, you know, business as usual without understanding what's going on there as well. So that, I believe, is the only place where we are really, really, where our action has serious, important consequences. I also believe, and this is a little bit in the EPP paper, that we will absolutely need to reform, let's say, the middle institution, the EIS, and have something that would be, we need an analytical brain. That's my sort of practical experience from working in the institutions. Alike of the National Security Council in the US, I know there was a discussion of creating National Security Council in Germany as well, but we need an analytical brain where the initial information, impulses, differences, etc., will be discussed far before they come to the COREPER level. Because very often you have some key discussions on foreign policy. They have to go up at a very high level. At a very high level, you get intergovernmental negotiations. What you need is, I think, analytical preparation of things far before they get there. I also believe, unlike many, I think, that member states are the heart of this. It really needs to come, this collective intelligence and collective analytical capacity has to come from member states. and the member states should be central to this effort. And the third piece is, I think Europe needs to focus on Europe. Europe needs to focus on the consolidation of the European space in terms of security, but also in terms of its capacity to project strengths. We absolutely need to focus on our industrial strengths. We have to focus on demographics and innovation. We have to be able to have perception as a group of countries or as an entity that knows very clearly what it wants and what its interests are. I was reading the economic security and it's really interesting how the instinct is always protection and somehow insulation. And I hoped that Global Gateway, but something that is more of a projection, will be part of that economic security paper, but it's not. So I think we really need to think of how best we can use the capabilities that we have to create the capacity to project. So I believe that in terms of the reform, EU is an elite project, and the reform should start from institutions, and then it trickles down to different layers. I really firmly believe that we should be pushing for two very prominent vice presidents in the next round. One for competitive Europe, that would also do, I think, the next iteration of Global Gateway, because what we have now, I'm not sure can really succeed, but someone who would be able to pool different pieces together and work for competitive Europe in the world. And we need, the name is enlargement, but for me it's consolidation of Europe. We need an enlargement vice president. We need someone who will have enough political power to be able to guide this policy in a proper way. This is where I would stop, and super happy for any questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Romana, sort of for this overview. A bit inward looking, I think, and maybe James will sort of offer a different view, maybe, on the British geostrategic approach. James, please, it was yours.
Thank you, Henning. Yes, I think I might actually have a slightly different approach here. I will just start, I think, by introducing or appraising the UK's strategic evolution over the last few years. I think there's been a fundamental reorientation in terms of strategic thinking in the UK, actually, since the late 2010s, and particularly accelerating over the last few years. The UK has identified that we're moving into a profoundly different era than what existed prior to after the Cold War. We're moving into a world of geopolitical competition where military force and nuclear deterrence are much more important than they were in the recent past. And this was identified in our integrated review from March 2021. We're moving into a much more geopolitical world. The terminology adopted was intensifying geopolitical competition or systemic competition, where a number of great powers are securing their interests, and really there are no rules anymore. You can do whatever you like. So the integrated review also identified that we're moving into a world that is defined by the breakdown, if not the collapse, of the old rules-based international system that we constructed in the aftermath of the Cold War, and also that there is a movement of power and interest towards the Indo-Pacific region, that the Euro-Atlantic was no longer central in the way that it has been even during the Cold War, and that power, both economic and military, was moving towards the Indo-Pacific. animated in no small part by the rise of the People's Republic of China, but also animated by the response of a number of countries in the region, including the United States, but also Japan, Taiwan, Australia, India, to the waxing and waning of power in the Indo-Pacific region. So the UK identified in this new context the need for a much different approach, one that is decidedly geostrategic, I would say. And insofar as the old rules-based order was collapsing, it advocated the need to shape what it called an open international order. The objective now is no longer to cling on to the past or cling on to the rules that we've determined, but rather to shape an international order of the future. And that would require a reappraisal of multilateralism and probably an increasing amount of support for minilateralism. That is to say, partnerships between like-minded states that are more fluid and more flexible, more agile, that can respond to the rapid shifts in power that are taking place across the world. The strategy was also decidedly geostrategic. It identified the centrality of the Euro-Atlantic to British interests. There was a lot of discussion after the Integrated Review's publication. This was probably animated by Britain's simultaneous almost decision to leave the European Union, that Britain was somehow moving away from Europe and focusing on the Indo-Pacific. But this wasn't true. The Integrated Review still put the Euro-Atlantic at the center of British strategic thinking, but it did also say that the UK would be tilting towards the Indo-Pacific in certain specific ways. There would be a military tilt to the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the maritime domain, but there would also be an economic shift to the Indo-Pacific to take advantage of the growth of Indo-Pacific economies. Beyond that, the strategy said that integrated national power was going to be far more important than it was in the past. And in some ways, the Integrated Review was a shift from the past of British strategic policy formulation. The Integrated Review is not a national security strategy, which is often a reactive document, but rather a power-driven document that seeks to shape the international order to address the threat. So it's more of a top-down approach rather than a bottom-up one. It also identified three main national interests for the UK, being the acquisition or the development of sovereignty, more security, and of course, prosperity. It said that there was also a very important point, and that is that words need to be backed with actions. In other words, it's not good enough to simply try and shape the international order through discourse and diplomacy, but you also need to have the ability to back those words up. And that brings me to the final point of the Integrated Review, and that was for the need for a military approach, i.e. the importance to deter aggressors from undertaking actions which we consider to be antithetical to our own interests, but also the interests of free and open countries everywhere. And that would require not only a re-emphasis of nuclear deterrence. The British nuclear stockpile was increased after the Integrated Review and still is, but also the development of a more permanent military presence, both in the Euro-Atlantic, but also in the Indo-Pacific. Now, fast forward on 2 years, and the government released, in the aftermath of Russia's renewed aggression towards Ukraine, a refresh of the Integrated Review, and this was published in March 2023. And in many ways, you should see this, I think, as a new chapter or an evolution of British strategic thinking. It advocated, or it looked to the return not only of geopolitical competition, as did the Integrated Review, around the world, but also the return of armed aggression, an explicit confrontation. It also identified that this was not something that was happening in distant theaters, such as the South China Sea or in other parts of the world, but primarily it was happening in Europe. And remember, in the aftermath of the Cold War, we thought that a postmodern order or some kind of security community was emerging in Europe, but Russia's actions have fundamentally brought that down. The Integrated Review refresh also identified a strategic framework that the UK would adopt. And in some ways, this was a codification or a more sophisticated way of thinking in terms of the original Integrated Review. And it said the UK would adopt 4 primary objectives in relation to its foreign and defence policy. The shaping the international environment would very much remain in place, but the UK would also seek to deter, defend, and compete across all domains. Power is being exercised across all domains, and you simply can't ignore them. The Chinese, the Russians, as I said before, are not particularly concerned about pre-existing rules. When necessary, they'll simply trample all over them, whether that's in the South China Sea or even in relation to state sovereignty in Ukraine. The strategic framework also identified the need to address vulnerabilities through enhanced national resilience, and particularly through the development of green technologies that would allow us to become more resilient, particularly in relation to becoming less reliant on foreign energy suppliers, whether they were hostile like Russia or less than stable like those in the Middle East. And then finally, the strategic framework identified a new idea, an idea that had actually been mentioned in the integrated review 2 years before, but was taken to a new level, and that is strategic advantage. How can a country like the UK, but this could also apply to other countries in Europe or indeed elsewhere, how can the UK generate strategic advantage over its competitors across the different domains? Where can it leverage its unique capability sets? Where can it partner with other countries to multiply the effort? And where can it extend and accelerate its power, whether that's in the Indo-Pacific or, more importantly, in the Euro-Atlantic? So I would say that these ideas, I think, have a degree of applicability to Europe. The only thing that I would say is that because the UK is no longer in the EU cannot be the central force for realizing a European geostrategic approach. There has to be some kind of partnership between the UK and other European countries, whether that's at the EU level or through unilateral structures, whether the Joint Expeditionary Force or enhanced relations between Britain and Germany or Britain and Ukraine or Britain and any other number of countries. There has to be a degree of flexibility and agility. And as we've seen over recent years, these more unilateral approaches have often provided or have generated greater impact than the more established multilateral approaches. And we can see them blossoming across the world. Perhaps AUKUS is the most potent example. So I think there's a very important point to be made here, that we need to think differently. We need to be more agile. We need to be looking outward more. We also need to reinforce NATO, and there needs to be a much stronger European focus here. And this is, of course, going to require increases in defense spending, the like of which we have not seen in many years. So there has been some discussion about the 2% of GDP on defense. Even this will not be enough for the kind of world that we're moving into. Let's not forget that in the closing years of the Cold War, most European countries, Germany included, were spending significantly more than 3 or 4%. The UK was spending around 5% of GDP at this time. This is the kind of spending level that we're going to need to invest into our armed forces to have the strategic impact that we desire in order to deter aggression and to uphold our way of life. We also are going to need to adopt something of a European military presence in the Indo-Pacific. This may not extend all the way to the Pacific Ocean in a permanent basis, but it will definitely need to focus on areas such as the Red Sea. Let's not forget that the maritime communication line that goes through the Red Sea affects Europe far more than it does the United States. It's our main supply line to the Middle East, and it's our main supply line to the manufacturing centers of East Asia. We also start to need to think a little more like a great power. It's no good asking to be a great power. You actually have to think and act like one. We can't be a middle power. We simply have too much at stake. And it's important, I think, also not to get distracted by strange concepts. So we have to go back to the very basics. This means power. This means military force, military capability, and deterrence. We need to remember that we're moving into a very different world. So where does this leave us? I would say if Europe wants to have the greatest strategic effect, securing its interest and securing a prosperous and relatively peaceful European space, it really does need to get to grips with constraining Russia in Ukraine. Because if Europe is able to constrain Russia in Ukraine and help Ukraine push Russia out, then this will create a degree of breathing space that will allow us to deal with many of the issues that sit beyond the European space, which are going to confront us in the years ahead. So there is a great deal of opportunity here, and also a great deal of opportunity for us to secure our interests and also our values. but this requires us to take a very different approach to the one that we've been so accustomed to over the last 20 to 30 years.
Thank you very much, James, for this rich presentation of the British outlook. Maybe before we open, just go back to Romana for a moment. You just heard the strong suggestion that the sort of Euro-Atlantic area, of course, very, very important, but it needs this kind of sort of strategic outreach maybe to in the Pacific. Do you think it's realistic for the EU, for Europe, to play a larger role than now in that area?
Yes, it is. And one thing that we have still not mentioned is the famous sort of global South concept and the whole North-South dialogue, where I think also European Union has a very important role to play. I mean, there is no doubt that pivot to Indo-Pacific is among the sort of priorities. The question is, and here I agree with James, there are things where I have question marks, but I absolutely agree that the first task we have is really Ukraine, because if we fail in the heart of Europe, it will be really almost impossible to project any kind of strength anywhere else, not to mention in the Pacific, where the game is much bigger. And we have a much less input that can be decisive for that game. This is something that I think is really important to be realistic. It's interesting, and I appreciated that the ambition in the UK is to be great power, not the middle power. I'm not sure that's realistic. I think we need to understand what's going on. And for me, the key piece that needs to be discussed, and James mentioned it a couple of times, is we want to shape international order of the future. I think this is the central point. And European Union believed that it was shaping the international order of the future through its normative power. And, for very long, you had an absolute trust in the fact that normative power is the power of the 21st century. And this is what is going to matter, not military, not whatever, but norms and governance they bring. And then, in a way, China proved us right, but the norms became somebody else's norms, at least in a large part of the world. So it's really important to understand also all the elements of power that are going to be important in the 21st century. How do you shape international order? Military deterrence, military strength, I understand that, but this is not what shapes or what will shape international order. So it is really important to try to be as realistic as possible and have the list of priorities. I mean, in the Pacific, absolutely. I spent 4 years working on that region with connectivity, and there are huge expectations from European Union. But again, it's not about the words. It's about the actions. And what actions are we undertaking and what actions can we undertake? I'll just mention one: free trade agreement with India. So there are things that I think we need to be far more agile with. And I fully agree with James, let go of the old ways, because the logic of 20th century is not going to help us in the 21st.
Thank you very much. We are past the 30-minute mark. So if you want to come in, you're most welcome to put your questions, comments, points of debate to our two speakers. There's one by Nicola von Schöpf. I will bring this into discussion at the moment, but I wanted to give James a chance to respond to this very, very sort of common accusation or sort of doubt maybe, which is prevalent in continental Europe, that the British approach is too ambitious, that it's sort of not realistic, maybe, as Romana said. Another point maybe also to you is this sort of how do you finance these necessary military spending, which we all see coming our way now. And is there a way where the UK and the EU could work together, setting up, I don't know, a common fund to finance Europe's rearmament? James, please.
Yeah, I think I just need to, I sort of think I take a little bit of issue with this idea of normative power. The EU had a degree of normative power in the 1990s and the 2000s, particularly in relation to countries that were formerly either under Soviet occupation or under communist regimes. And this was a very unique environment, a very unique sort of historical period as well. I think the EU's normative power is far less extensive beyond the immediate kind of vicinage around the EU, and it probably has declined substantially in recent years. The fundamental dimension of power is military power, and I would go beyond that and say it's geostructural. It's the ability to use military power to shape the international environment in ways that are conducive to your overall strategic approach. So, we heard quite a lot of discussion in recent years about the importance of the EU in creating peace in Europe. For me, this is a fantasy. It's a complete fiction. NATO creates peace in Europe. The EU is a consequence of that peace. And although the EU and other forms of cooperation like it play a fundamentally important function, they're not ultimately responsible for the initial creation of an environment in which peace can take root. And you can see that today in relation to Ukraine. If you have areas or countries which are fundamentally unstable and can be exploited by predatory powers, such as Russia or such as the People's Republic of China, and of course there were others in the past in the Middle East, then you will get vacuums of insecurity that will spill out all around their regions, causing all sorts of headaches for countries such as our own in Europe. So I think we really do need to get to grips with this issue, and we need to understand just how important military power is, and not just armies. I'm talking about the ability to project force and power into regions to deter and dissuade aggressors, whether it's Russia or countries in the Middle East or the Houthis in Yemen or the PRC. And in that context, I think we need to look at how we can work together, how free and open countries, whether they're in the Euro-Atlantic or the Indo-Pacific or anywhere for that matter, can work together to secure the kind of international order that we all prefer, that allows organizations and entities such as the EU or the African Union or countless others to take root and prosper, and to deliver that additional layer of security across the domains that helps us all to prosper. I suppose just to answer your additional question about funding, yes, this is an issue that we all need to come to terms with and start thinking about more credibly. The good years of the 1990s and the 2000s are over, and we do now need to start thinking about how we can invest more money into our militaries, into our ability to shape the international order, because it's always cheaper in the long run to do that rather than to invest vast sums of money over very short periods of time when war comes upon us. And we've seen that happen in the past, and we should not think for one moment that won't happen again. There was a speech given by there have been several speeches, in fact, given in my country in recent months that are saying that we're no longer in a post-war world, we're now in a pre-war world. And this is extremely dangerous if we allow that kind of thinking in a way to take root, that we can fight a war in the way that we did in the past, because of course we're all the major powers, from China to Russia to the United States to the UK and others, are all armed with nuclear weapons, and this adds a degree of complexity to the situation that previously did not exist.
Thank you very much, James. I think it's time for our first round of questions. There's Alberto Rizzi. Please introduce yourself. And
we also have a question in the chat.
Yes, I'll come to that in a moment. Thank you. Alberto, please.
Hello, my name is Alberto Rizzi. I'm a researcher in geoeconomics at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And I have a question for Ambassador Vlahutin about the global gateway, because the EU has shown to have significant geostrategic power in relation to countries that were about to enter the Union, but it lacks the same kind of capabilities towards those actors that it cannot offer any credible path to membership. And I'm thinking about the Global South, Gulf, Middle Eastern actors, the Indo-Pacific. So it needs a sort of a framework that's both a narrative and a tool to deal with that. And in my view, the Global Gateway can fill this role. But I would like to ask, what should the next Commission focus on to turn this initiative into a successful one?
Thank you very much. Next is Hartmut Fischer, please. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, Hartmut Fischer. I'm a private citizen, a member of DGAP. I would like to go back to the, James, what you were saying about the initial framework for the UK strategy was to look at also economic and other aspects of national security. And my feeling is that the discussion is going too strongly down the road of either military power or normative power. My impression is that we will need all of those elements in the future. There will be some instances where we need military power. We need to be prepared for that. There's other areas where we can work with normative power or with building multilateral rules, which are much preferable, engaging in war if possible and available. And in order to fund that, project, there's also the soft power aspect. Of is the European culture and way of life attractive to others? If yes, it will pull in more people into cooperation, some more, some less, and we need to have a strong economy to project. That's also part of the soft power, and it's also part of the funding mechanism for a strong military. And last but not least, we need to address, the issues that are giving rise to the rightist movements within Europe. They don't have the right answers, but they are addressing valid causes to a relevant part of inequity in society and other things. And so, I think that sounds like a lot, but I think those are we need to be in those playing fields, addressing domestic issues, a strong economy, projecting a good soft power, which means that we also stand to our values and not, apply them selectively, build a military and engage in rule-based and normative cooperation with other countries.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think your point was well made. The third point I want to bring into the discussion as well by Nikolai von Schöpf, who has written in the chat, sort of saying that isn't it a clear sign of the EU's strategic weakness that it cannot even make sort of candidate countries to sort of align with its stances on Russian sanction and beyond. That's certainly a question for Romana, I think. But please, who wants to go and address some of the points made? Romana, maybe?
Go and link the two. First, a reply to Nikolai, absolutely. I mean, it's mind-boggling the way EU is dealing with the Western Balkans. If there is any place in this world where EU has leverage, that's the Western Balkans. And why it's not using that leverage, it's beyond me. It's incredible. We have actually done the opposite. By this behavior, we have created strategic maneuvering space for Russia, China, Iran, etc., to be present in the Balkans and create situations which can take away our attention from other important theaters within 24 hours. If you would have an incursion of Serbian army into northern Kosovo, I mean, half of Europe will just shut down for other business in a way because it will be in their immediate neighborhood. So the politics of the EU towards Western Balkans, I really don't understand it anymore. We have again all the leverage of this on this earth, and yet at the same time, I'll just give you one practical example. European Union is giving 2.2 billion euros for the reconstruction of a piece of railway between Belgrade and Niš, which would connect reconstruction of a piece of railway, which would connect to the railway Belgrade, Budapest, and then down to the Piraeus port. So we're basically building a railway for China. I mean, it's something that needs to be discussed, I think, far more seriously. And on Global Gateway, I think the whole logic of going out there and actively helping your partners and yourself create a new, if you wish, geostrategic map of value chains is absolutely something that we need to do. But the methodology that has been chosen, I don't think can deliver, because this is treated as development framework. Investment in strategic infrastructure cannot be done with ODA. The nature of the intervention is completely different. The interests on both sides are completely different. We're talking about industrial policy here. We're not talking about developmental policy. And this is, I think, a key mistake in the system. And this is not also what our partners in the South need. They need a scale that ODA cannot provide. So this instinct of institutions to do more of the same is the wrong instinct. We need to take a completely different course. And again, finally, I'll finish with that. Power. I think the definition of power, maybe you should devote the next sort of discussion on what power is. But China became a massive power without using any military power. So military power, absolutely, I agree. We have to build up the European side of NATO. I mean, no questions asked. But normative power is not going to come without industrial power. You cannot regulate industries that you don't have or are not strong enough. So I think that the whole discussion also, again, has to be about how do we strengthen ourselves and how do we understand our own strengths and use them for projection.
Thank you very much, James.
Yeah, I kind of agree with a lot of that. Again, it's sort of getting us to this idea that we need to let go of the conventions of the past and embrace new thinking. So if development aid or official development assistance is not the way forward, then let's get rid of it, let's jettison it and rethink the rules. We set the rules often in the 1990s and the 2000s, thinking that everyone would abide by them, that everyone would be would think that there's mutual advantage in operating them. But we're in a situation now where a number of countries, Russia, of course, China, of course, in different areas, but also a lot of other countries as well, are beginning to exploit the rules to their own advantage. And this has an overall disadvantage to us. So we need to be much more prepared to rethink things that are not working in the way that we initially hoped that they would, so that they continue to advantage us as well as everybody else that wants to abide by them, of course. This isn't to say that we just go off in our own direction and exploit everyone or something along those lines. But we do need to be prepared to be more, how do I put it, radical, let's say, to change things that are not working as effectively as they might be. But I would just say that, and I also agree with the fact that, industrial power is still important. And I think that's also been overlooked. And this comes on to one of the questions or the points made earlier about kind of geoeconomic power. That's something I think that we need to give much more attention to. Europe in particular, and I include here also the UK, has seen a substantial fall in our relative share of global economic output over the last 20 years. And this is obviously going to have strategic implications. But I think some of this is self-inflicted. There's no point in creating a kind of a truly open economic system if we are in the long run going to be disadvantaged by it, and others that are less benevolent than we may have been, particularly the Chinese, also the Russians, are allowed to exploit all of our vulnerabilities to get inside of our industrial and political and economic ecosystems and to turn them in a way against us, or to dump goods into our markets, or to buy up our industries and then to close them down and take the technology to China or wherever else. So I think we do need to rethink some of this, but that's not something that can be done by the EU by itself. This needs some other format, some other framework, such as the G7, which includes other large industrialized states. This can't be arrived at by the United States alone, by the EU alone, by the UK or Japan alone. This needs some kind of coordinated effort, but it requires that we have a different way of thinking, which is more strategically driven or geopolitically driven than it has in the recent past. And I think even there, we are not there yet.
Thank you very much. Another question by Reinhold Blender, please.
Yeah, many thanks. Let me briefly introduce myself. I'm a former European Union official. I've worked almost 30 years in the EU system, in the European Commission and in the External Action Service. And we know each other well, Romana and myself. So my greetings also to her. I have two observations, essentially. I think the debate has covered really a broad range of important issues. But for me, the crux of the issue for Europe to become a geostrategic player is to come to a better understanding how we see the decision-making at European level. The key issue is really, and it has not been said, in my view, clearly enough, also in the papers I read, that essentially we cannot easily compare the European Union with a nation state. You know, we are 27. We are not one single player. And I believe that does make a big difference. So it's essentially how can the 27 come to common decisions and carry them out? That is the key question. What is possible there to make these things move? And the second point on the role of Europe in more generally, I personally think Europe unavoidably has a global role, because whether we like it or not, the world has become a single strategic theater, as I see it. You know, what is happening in Ukraine, there are interlinkages with what is going on in Asia. Prime Minister Kishida has very clearly said what is happening in Ukraine can be happening in East Asia tomorrow, seemingly, as it seems he was alluding to Taiwan or the South China Sea, what China could do there. So I believe the question then is, how do we manage this big challenge of not only getting our decisions at European level, but also enabling us to be effective at global level, where there are limits also in terms of capacity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this intervention. Romana, you already suggested that you're not a great believer in the qualified majority voting, that this will be the silver bullet. Are there other ideas sort of how to improve the sort of decision making?
Yes, I mean, I'm not a believer in it because I have seen and the dynamics within the council is such that you don't want really to go into a situation where you create camps. And I think qualified majority voting would create camps. There are already enough possibilities for European Union member states to make decisions, even if somebody does not agree. We have just seen something happened recently, and the way the dynamics around the 50 billion for Ukraine has been voted. Also, I think what would be ideal, if possible, would be anonymity -1, so that a country that has a sole issue either has to persuade others that this issue is worth their effort, or just cannot ride and dysfunction everybody else because of that one particular issue they have. So this is something that I think is interesting. But what is far more important is, I think also, again, from practice, to have some key definitions at the very beginning. And this is something that only member states among themselves can do. So the way decision-making is done now is just slow enough, is tired And I think we really need to think of how to reform the EIS, how to have a place in the EU that would help create this mutual understanding between member states at an earlier level. And then I think, of course, European Union has a global role, but having a global role and being a global power are two different things. So it is important to understand where our key interests are and how we can pursue them. And if we are strong in what we do, it will also help us project stronger in other theaters. So the fact that, I mean, EU will never be a nation state. It will never have the same instinct that a nation state has. You don't even have to make an analytical approach to who is definitions of enemy, etc. But the fact that we're 27 also has its strengths. And again, I've seen it from working with external partners who every time they want to hurt EU, go to individual member states. But when member states create a front, then usually we win on those issues. It's a very interesting dynamics. This is why you saw a recent Chinese pivot again to Germany or to France, or they're trying because they think working with individual member states is going to get them what they want. So I think working on this togetherness is very important, and for that, trust making is super important. I mean, and this can happen again only by somehow making this cumulative force of 27 being used better.
Thank you very much. And it also includes a rebalancing. I think the sort of Franco-German engine, and the idea that this engine will solve everything is not useful, including for France and Germany. Yeah,
so that's a discussion that I think also needs to happen.
Yeah, some radical thinking, as James said, sort of maybe also applies to that particular part of how Europe is sort of functioning. Yeah. James, last word. I mean, we've got only 2 minutes left. There is one almost sort of philosophical question, whether this is the geospatial self-perception of Europe is sort of is in some way sort of impacting on how we see Eurasia, Indo-Pacific, and there's a geostrategic value or meaning for us. I don't know whether you want to touch on that, but maybe you want to finish on a different note. It's up to you.
Yeah, I would just finish by saying, the UK left the EU, and in some ways the most globally oriented of EU states is no longer in the EU. So naturally there will probably be an impact there, whether it will be taken up by others that have had a global approach, like the Netherlands or France or Spain or Portugal, remains to be seen. All I would say is, and I think the point was made by one of the last people to ask a question, is that and this was also something I should have mentioned when I was trying to outline the UK's approach. We can't look at the world anymore as the Euro-Atlantic and then the Indo-Pacific or Africa or South America or whatever. I mean, the world is becoming increasingly woven together economically. And one of the things that the Integrated Review Refresh here embraced was the idea of Atlantic-Pacific connectivities. And I think in the context of both strategically, militarily, but also in the context of economics or global economics, we need to think outside of established boxes. So the EU can't do everything, even economically or by itself, even for its own members. There's going to have to be more connectivities between free and open countries wherever they are. So the EU, the UK, Canada, the US, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, other countries that are kind of moving within there or aligning with their their principles and values. We need to find something which allows us to stand up for our principles, our values, our economic preferences, and prevents the likes of Russia and China and others from exploiting our vulnerabilities and imposing on their own regions their own normative principles, leveraging the sheer size of their energy markets or their industrial might to that effect. And I think that's probably the key question of the 2020s into the 2030s. And there's a lot of thinking, I think, here that needs to be done to extract us from old-fashioned thinking and to generate the new architecture that will help us to prevail as free and open countries with a specific set of principles and values in the 21st century.
And with that, I call this sort of meeting this first IPQ debate to a close. Please join me in thanking our two speakers, Romana Vlahutin and James Rogers. Thank you all for joining us this lunchtime, and we are looking forward to offer further IPQ debates in the future. So please stay tuned and check out the winter issue, which I just posted the link to it again. And with that, I'm wishing you all a very good day. See you soon again at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Good afternoon.